Well, good morning. It's good to be here this day, beautiful day. And it is good to have Richard Blake with us from the Christian Prison Ministries of the Midwest, correct? Mid-America. Keep saying Midwest. Okay, Mid-America. So, we're close, huh? But it's good to have him with us, and reminding us today when he was in the Sunday school hour that the long-term relationship that Christian prisons have with Westside and the support and the encouragement. We count it a privilege when he was sharing, the people that have had the gospel presented to them and the responses to that. Over 700 and plus baptisms. It's just amazing. We count them as a part of our outreach, and we're grateful for that. So Richard, thank you for your service and going to the prisons. Thank you for your years as a director to get the ministry on a stable foundation and footing to lead it into the future. And thank you for going there and being a part of reaching out with those people that are incarcerated today. And so we're grateful for that. Today we are looking at the eighth commandment, which is, you shall not steal. And the Hebrew word for steal originally had the idea of being kidnapped, to carry away secretly. In Genesis chapter 37, there in verses 17 through 36, Joseph, we kind of have Joseph's story, how his brothers grabbed him and they threw him into a pit and they ripped that coat of many colors off of his back and they tore it all up and they sold him for 20 shekels of silver to a caravan of Ishmaelite spice traders who were making their way to Egypt. And in Egypt, Joseph ends up in Potiphar's house. He's a slave of Potiphar. He's stripped of his possessions. His inheritance is stolen from him. His hopes, his dreams are all shattered. Kidnapping is the ultimate in stealing. Kidnapping someone is to take from them their life. It's taking from them their reputation, their goods, their productivity, their hopes, their dreams. And so to steal, ultimately, when we show such a disrespect for a person that we take from them what is rightfully their possession, even destroying who they are in the process. In the book of Deuteronomy, in chapter 24, there it kind of puts these two ideas together of stealing and kidnapping. And in Deuteronomy 24, verse 7, it says that if a man is caught kidnapping, that same exact word is used from the Genesis text. But if a man is caught kidnapping, if any of his countrymen and the sons of Israel, and he deals with them violently or sells him, then that thief shall die. So you shall purge the evil from among you. So the thief is a kidnapper who is put to death. So the focus for us this morning here with this eighth commandment is to respect. Think about it that way, to respect. Respecting others by respecting what they possess. Now, would you agree with me that in our culture, stealing has just become a way of life? It sure seems to be. Go back a few years and look at Martha Stewart, the icon homemaker, and she was kind of a goddess for America. And Martha served her 5-month sentence at Camp Cupcake, incarcerated there at a prison in West Virginia, because she had sold stocks in a way that ripped other people off. Now, if she would have been in Congress, she could have got away with it, but she wasn't. Corporations lie about their products all the time. Their advertisements, exaggerate the quality of an item. packaging. Sometimes something is twice as big. You've all gotten those Amazon packages where you get this big box and you got to like, something the size of a Twinkie inside just rattling around. That kind of exaggeration. And the buyer has to beware, caveat emptor. We need to beware because if we're not, we're going to get ripped off. Employees steal from employers. I saw a report that said that up to 80% of employees steal an average of 3 hours and 45 minutes a week from their employers. All of those perks of time and things. And I didn't realize that people might even wonder about that. And then here in this year, with the waste, fraud, and abuse of taxpayer money, and the people that have become irate over that discovery. I mean, have you ever gone to buy something and wondered if the seller was actually telling you everything you needed to know and should know? And think of all the laws, the fine print, the pages of forms and documents that exist just because people don't trust one another. There was a young lawyer who moved to a small town, and he opened his office right on Main Street in that town. After 3 months of no business, he was ready to call it quits. When another lawyer moved into town and opened an office right across the street from him, and now both of them are doing well. Think about how many lawyers would be out of a job if we just obeyed the 8th commandment. I saw recently an article where there was a school that had moved a bus stop because, the kids were vandalizing the people's property, so they keep moving this bus stop. And now they've got the bus stop by an open field. But there was all sorts of vandalism and graffiti and dropping of trash on the ground. And then when they had it in front of different homes, they were, borrowing things from, not returning them. That's stealing. It's disrespecting them, taking from them what is rightfully theirs, their right to control their own property, their livelihood. We could go on with example after example. We live in a society where stealing is a way of life. But for the Christian, it shouldn't be that way. We're to be distinctive. We are to live differently. And there are 2 truths that I want to share with you this morning. 2 truths that if we can keep these things in mind, we can live differently. We will live differently so much so people will notice and recognize that, and we will be able to walk in obedience to this 8th commandment. And truth number 1 is that all stuff is God's stuff. All stuff is God's stuff. Psalm 24:1 says, "The earth is the Lord's and all it contains, the world and those who dwell in it." Think about what that means for a moment. Think about that. In Acts chapter 5, we have the story in the first 11 verses there about Ananias and Sapphira, how they sold a piece of property, and then they took the money from the sale of that property and they brought it to the church. Now, before they brought it to the church, they kept some of the money from the sale of that property. They kept it to themselves. But when they went and gave the money to the church, they told them and acted like that was the total amount of the sale of the property. And God judged them and they both dropped dead. Now, they did a generous thing. They sold their property. They gave a donation to the church. That's the right thing to do. But something got messed up in their hearts where they thought that they had to lie, that they thought they had to manipulate things for their own benefit. They were wanting to look like they were something that more so than they were. Back in the days of Malachi, God, the prophet, God was dealing with this same kind of issue of the heart with his people there. And God comes to his people and says there in Malachi 3:7-12, he says, "You're stealing from me." And the people say, "What? What do you mean? We're doing all the things that you've asked us to do. We're doing all the right things, mostly." I mean, they believed God. They were going to the temple. They were doing all of their services. They were giving offerings and sacrifices and making donations. And God gives them an illustration of what he's talking about. He says, And he asks the question, will a man rob God? Is that even possible? Is it impossible for a man to steal something from Almighty God who possesses all of creation? That's kind of a hard thing to wrap your mind around, isn't it? But God says, yet you're robbing me. And the people go, well, how have we robbed you? And God's answer is in tithes and offerings. See, stealing is not always taking something from somebody, but it's also holding on to something that belongs to someone else. In this case, the people were hanging onto the tithe that they owed to God. Now, there are a number of observations that we could make about tithing, but the bottom line of why God used that illustration there and why I'm sharing it here in this portion of the message this morning is because tithing is a physical demonstration of the condition of our hearts. God is telling his people, you're robbing me. And that's how God points to what is seriously wrong in the hearts of the people. What was seriously wrong in the heart of Ananias and Sapphira. And many people have that same struggle today. See, tithing isn't about how resourceful we are. It's not based on the size of the budget, or it's not how much the church, much money the church may or may not have. To tithe is to put God first. That's what it comes down to. It's putting God first, to set God's his amount aside first. And to tithe is to give God obediently, to give to God regularly, to give to God in proportionate with what he gives us. And when we actually give God the priority, that way we take off the top, of what God blesses us with, and then we begin trusting God to take care of our needs. And the trust touches the deep part of our hearts that God is talking about, and God's saying to his people, if you trusted me, then you wouldn't hesitate to give to me. You see, when we hesitate, that's an indication to ourselves that we're trusting ourselves more so than trusting the Lord. And thinking about all stuff being God's stuff, looking at a world in which we live, most people are struggling against each other by, trying to divide up the piece of the pie to get a bigger chunk of the pie for themselves, or to hold on to have control of a piece that they have. But you know what's more important than not grabbing our piece of the pie at the expense of somebody else's? What's more important is trusting the person who owns the pie shop. God owns the pie shop. And so if we understand that all stuff is God's stuff, then we're freed from the need. So you don't have situations like Ananias and Sapphira where people lie and deceive and rob and disrespect others and thinking about just themselves and at the expense even of others. And all we have to do is to trust God, who gives generously to meet our needs. Have you ever watched a child build sandcastles? Have you ever watched that? I mean, the imagination runs wild, and they have their buckets and they have their shovels and they're filling them up with sand and they're turning them upside down, and they're making turrets and towers and walls, and they use feathers and they use twigs and sticks for flag poles and other things like that. They dig moats around it. They will spend all day doing something like that. We might spend all day doing something like that. Making something out of nothing but a few little grains of sand. But imagine our world as adults building things out of nothing. Running from place to place, answering phones and commitments and obligations. And, we got our tax-deferred annuities that become our walls for our sandcastles. And we have capital gains, which is the towers and monuments of our achievements and our life's work and our security. But what happens near sunset? What happens near sunset at the beach? it all gets washed away. Maybe sooner than we think. I mean, what do we achieve? What do we gain by having a larger piece of the pie? And so a child will, after they've done all that work, they can sit back and they will watch the tide come in and it'll wash away everything that they've worked for hours. And then they'll enjoy the sunset. Then they'll pick up their shovel, they'll pick up their buckets, and they'll grab their father's hand and they'll go home. No stress, no anxiety, no fear. But we fear the tide, the waves of years that come to collapse our little castles. And maybe we need to learn from our children. See, God owns the sand. He controls the waves. And so we trust him. All stuff is God's stuff. There's a second truth, and that is stealing is a great opportunity. Hang on a second before you think about that one. But I want you to think about that one. I mean, it would be so easy to say to ourselves, I'm not stealing from anyone. I mean, how does that relate to me? I'm not stealing from anyone. See, we need to move beyond seeing the commandment here, number 8, of what we're not supposed to do, and to see it as an opportunity to be able to do something. So let's say this in the positive. The positive version of this commandment would be, you shall respect the possessions of others. If I'm not stealing, I'm respecting the possession of others. And that's a great opportunity, because when we do that, we make a major difference in our society. We make a major impact in people's lives. When Ted Williams, who was a great baseball player, was 40 years old, and his career was broken up twice for serving in the military. He served in World War II and he served in Korea, and he still had a 20-year baseball career. And he's still the last person to hit 400 in a season. And it was an amazing player. But he, for the first time in his life, at age 40, he hit under 300. He hit 254, and he only had 10 home runs. But at that time, before 1960, this is about 1958, he was the highest paid player in sports. Baseball, basketball, football. He made $125,000 a year. Well, considering houses were only about $4,000 or $5,000, that was pretty good income. Okay? Well, that next year, what had happened was he had a pinched nerve in his neck when he was 40, and he was left-handed, could hardly turn to see the pitcher. And so consequently, he had a lower batting average than he normally would. And so when he got his contract back from the Red Sox, they sent him again, a $125,000 contract. And he sent it back with a note that said he would not sign unless they gave him, paid the contract that allowed for him to have the reduction of the maximum at that time, which was 25%. He said, I never had a problem with the team ever giving me money. And so now they were offering him a contract he said, I didn't deserve. A contract I didn't deserve. And he felt like he was stealing from them. He was taking something that wasn't rightfully his. And so he reduced his salary that year by $31,000. In a society, in a world, even in his day, where we reward corruption and selfishness, how many people do you know would do that? Can you think of anybody that would do that? But if we really understand that everything is God's, then our whole priority system for having and using things should change. It should be different from the society that we live in. We shouldn't be looking like the people that we live in, the society in which we live. We ought to look different. We need to be distinct. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, we read that God created Adam and Eve. And that he gives them stewardship over the earth. The garden is theirs. It's growing, it's producing its fruits. And the animals are there, and they're doing animal things. And God tells Adam and Eve, he says, fill the earth, subdue it, and rule over it. And God gives us stewardship over his world. He gives us responsibility for managing his creation. He gives us, to manage things according to his will. And it's okay to have stuff, but we need to think biblically about God's instruction as to how we use what he gives us. Because God is continually placing in front of us opportunities to make a difference. Let me give you two opportunities to kind of get you started. If you ask God to show you more than this, I'm sure he will. Okay, but this will just kind of get us started. And the first opportunity is compassion. Compassion. In Job, chapter 31 there in verse 16, Job said, "If I have denied the desire of the poor or let the eyes of the widow grow weary, if I have kept bread to myself, not sharing it with the fatherless, if I had seen anyone perish for lack of clothing or a needy man without a garment, if I have raised my hand against the fatherless, then let my arm fall from the shoulder. Let it be broken off at the joint, for I dread destruction from God, and for fear of his splendor, I should not do such things." And then in Matthew chapter 25, Jesus says there in that section of scripture, he said, "I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. Naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me." And they said, "Lord, when did we do that for you? When did we see you there?" And Jesus said, "When you did it to the least of these, my little ones, you have done it unto me." Scripture from cover to cover teaches us to be generous with others, using God-given resources, not to fearfully hoard, not so that we can steal more, but to use them so that we can care for people in acts that are unreturnable. Compassion for others. There's a second suggestion here, and that's justice. In James chapter 5, James is writing about justice and the misuse of wealth. And in James 5 there in the first 6 verses, he says, "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries which are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted, and your garments have become moth-eaten. Your gold and your silver have rusted, and their rust will be a witness against you and will consume your flesh like fire. It's in the last days that you have stored up your treasures. Behold, the pay of the laborers who mowed your field, to which has been withheld by you, cries out against you. And the outcry of those who did the harvesting has reached the ears of the Lord of Sabbath. You have lived luxuriously on the earth and have led a life of wanton pleasure. And you have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter, and you have condemned and put to death the righteous man. He does not resist you." In James's day, the economy structure, if you had a pyramid of the economy, you would see there were 5 different groups of people that were a part of this economic ladder of success, so to speak, or a pyramid of success. And the bottom of that ladder rung, you would find slaves. Then up from the slaves, they didn't have anything, okay? They were slaves. They were owned by others. And then next to them, we have what is called the landless peasants, who hired themselves out as day labor. And if there was work, then they got their wage for the day, which would be a denarius. But if there wasn't work for that day, then they starved. And thirdly, there were the farmers and the artisans who might have had land, or they may have been forced off their land, and now they were working on what was maybe their land, and they worked for a new landowner. And so the life of the laborer, it was cheap labor. Then there was the merchants and traders, who were pretty well off, But in fact, some of them were really pretty rich. But the top of the economic ladder was the large landowners and the priests. They had large tenant farms and estates, and they spent most of their time in Jerusalem enjoying themselves. And their whole focus was on just themselves. And it really didn't matter what they did to accumulate the wealth that they indulged themselves in. They paid almost nothing they wouldn't pay anybody a wage to live on. In fact, they actually cheated people out of their wages. And they ran people off of their own land. And the poor worker who might have only a denarius for a day, that day's wage at the top, somebody at the top of the end might spend 400 denarii in just self-indulgent extravagance. And James is very specific. Accumulation and hoarding of wealth at the expense of others is stealing. It's sin. And so we need to act so that justice is done, so that the rules are the same for everyone, and so that people are not getting rich at the unjust expense of others, or so that in our consumptive society and lifestyle here in the United States that other people are not, it's not killing people in other countries. In Pompeii, in Italy, there is a museum of things that they've excavated from the city. And there was a body of a woman that was found that was mummified by the volcanic ash of Mount Vesuvius. And the position that she was found tells a really tragic story, because the position of her feet were pointing toward the city gate. And in other words, she was facing away from safety. She wasn't, she had safety was behind us. She was facing away from, and her outstretched arms and fingers were straining for something that lay just beyond what she could reach. And the treasure that she was reaching for was a bag of pearls. What are we grabbing onto? See, God continually places opportunities before us to live counterculturally in a way that meets the needs of others. And we don't just meet their needs, but we meet their needs with compassion. We meet their needs with justice, and that respects others, and it respects what they possess, and in the process, that glorifies God. That demonstrates the reality of the gospel. And if we're trusting God, then we should take the lead in respecting others rather than trying to rip them off for our own selves. This morning, as we come to our invitation time, we're going to be using hymn 330, Are You Washed in the Blood? And the question for us here today is we see from this, we need to be distinctive people. But from this, God is a covenant God. He's not a God of quid pro quo. That's not the way he works. But he wants to have a covenant relation, be in a covenant relationship with us. And he showed us how the extent of what he wanted to do for us when he gave us his son Jesus to pay the penalty for our sin debt that we can't pay. There's no way we can pay it. But he paid it for us. This morning, if you're here this day and that you've never made Jesus Christ the Lord and Master of your life, we want to give you that opportunity to do that. Maybe you have some questions that you would like to ask. We want to give you an opportunity to have them answered. Whatever that might be, we invite you to share that with us. Won't you stand as we sing, Are You Washed in the Blood?